Today we're going to talk about updated DNA evidence for the Book of Mormon, in particular focusing on Haplogroup X and the evidence it provides for the Book of Mormon. I'm going to bring out some new Haplogroup X evidence and what it may mean. First, we'll start with a recap of the Haplogroup X mitochondrial DNA evidence for the Book of Mormon. Once I finish that recap, I'll then address the new information that's available and assess what that means. So first, let's recap and cover a little bit of the basics about the Native American DNA. One of the DNA type tests that you can do is the mitochondrial DNA. It tests the matrilineal line, the mother's line. And when they've done that for Native Americans, as most of you will know, there are five main founding groups that are found. They're referred to as haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X. And the key one for the Book of Mormon is the haplogroup X, because that fifth matrilineal DNA line is considered to have originated in the Middle East. So what makes haplogroup X so interesting is that it's an authentic, clearly documented ancient Native American DNA type, which is not easily explained through a migration across the Bering Strait from Asia. And instead, the DNA type clearly originated in the Middle East. And so then it's a question of how did this Middle Eastern origin DNA get into ancient Native Americans? So it's a great piece of evidence for the Book of Mormon. When you look at the other matrilineal, the mitochondrial DNA types, you can use what are called heat maps. This shows where the colors show where this DNA type occurs anciently and among indigenous populations. And what you see is that for Native Americans, some of the DNA types do appear to relate to having come from Asia. For example, this mitochondrial haplogroup A. Same with mitochondrial haplogroup C. Similarly with mitochondrial haplogroup D. Mitochondrial haplogroup B is a little more interesting because it doesn't show its existence across the Bering Strait. Instead, it's more related to Central Asian populations that somehow came to the Americas. It's generally assumed that it must have come through the Bering Strait, even though that's not currently found there. But then when you look at the haplogroup X and where it occurs particularly among Native Americans in the Northeast North America. These are primarily Algonquin tribes. And then in the Old World, as to where did it come from, the primary location where it is found is in that Mediterranean area, in particular in the Middle East, also called the Near East. It's the highest concentrations where the haplogroup X is found is Native Americans and among the Middle Eastern populations. And so that has caused a lot of people to wonder, so how on earth did this ancient Middle Eastern type DNA get to the Americas, especially without showing up on the previously thought, migration routes that would have occurred. But it fits the Book of Mormon great because it would fit with a migration by boat. For haplogroup X, in addition to just being mostly found, that largest concentration in the Middle East, there's additional evidence which points to the Middle East as the likely place of origin for it, because the closest related DNA outside of the Americas so for this, there's subtypes of this haplogroup X. It's haplogroup X to A and haplogroup X to G. Those two DNA subtypes, when you look at where is the closest related DNA outside of America. So when you look at, okay, where they had to have come from somewhere, where did it most likely come from? You would look to where is the closest related DNA outside of the Americas. And that closest related DNA outside of out of the Americas is in the Middle East. It was particularly in Iran and Egypt is where they found the closest related DNA to Native American haplogroup X2A outside of the Americas. And in fact, as I said, the Native Americans, the two DNA types, those two Native American DNA types, they're relatively closely related, but X2A is actually more closely related to the Middle Eastern DNA type X2J than it is to even the other Native American type X2G. So this points to that. So genetically, some of this Native American DNA type X2A, it's actually more closely related to Middle Eastern, Near Eastern populations than it is to even some of the other Native American DNA types X2G. I'll go ahead and show that to you in just a second here. So, for example, this is from the peer-reviewed literature. This is from a study by Bolnick when she puts together the tree. It's sort of like a family tree. It's using genetics. They make sort of like a family tree of the DNA types, like the mutations. And when you look at where it comes from, so X in generally, it's North Africa. When it says North Africa here, think Egypt. So the Egypt in the Near East is where these populations primarily had this DNA type anciently. And then when you get to the types near what is in North America, the Native Americans, this is the Native Americans. So the Native Americans have two DNA types, X2A and X2G, that are of this type. And what I was saying about the X2A being closer related to the Near Eastern type than it is to the other North American DNA type, as you can see that here. So the X2A for Native Americans is actually even more closely related to the Near Eastern relatives than it is to the other North American relative. And when you look at the closest relatives in the old world, it was in Egypt and Iran. I'll go ahead and show you that as well. So this is in my book, Face of a Nephite. You can see the book over my shoulder. In the footnotes, I have a couple of the peer-reviewed citations for this. It's not just me saying this, but as indicated in these studies with the citations, they are how the Near East is the likely geographical source for haplogroup X2 to the Americas, and that there's no support to a Beringian route to the Americas for X2A because there's no evidence of haplogroup X in that East Asia, Northeast Siberia, or near the Bering Strait, like I had shown you in that map. And then also when you look at where is it most frequent anciently and the greatest diversity, so where it had developed longest, all that points to the Near East as its point of origin. And again, all those sites there. In Egypt, this is where the location of the closest related DNA type. So for ancient Native Americans who have this haplogroup X2A, when you look at the closest relative outside of the Americas, it was in an oasis here in Egypt is the closest one they found outside of the Americas. And so this sort of kind of explains it here. Again, you have this Native American DNA types more closely related to what's found in Iran and Egypt than to even what's found in North America. Okay, now the counter argument for haplogroup X, again, it's fantastic information for it, but the counter argument against haplogroup X has always been the dating for it. And there are two dating arguments that were made. One is based off of using a molecular clock. I've done prior videos on this, so I won't get too deeply into it. But what they say is, well, using evolutionary theories, they're kind of estimating these really long dates for how long it takes for the DNA to mutate. And based off of those average rates, they estimate much older migrations. And so they say, well, X came before Book of Mormon timeframes. But on the other hand, pedigree studies, where you aren't just using an evolutionary time frame assumption, but you're actually testing pedigree charts, people to see how fast it actually mutates, as opposed to just theoretically mutates. So again, clarifying, when they use DNA for dating, they are using theoretical dating. When you instead use actual dating tests versus theoretical dating, what they find is that the actual test, the pedigree studies, show that human DNA mutation rates are much, much faster than under the evolutionary theories. And so what that means is that the human migrations with haplogroup X likely occurred more recently and can actually fit Book of Mormon timeframes. So that's the first counter argument on the dating. The second argument about the dating is with carbon dating. And there is an individual, an ancient Native American named Kennewick Man. And Kennewick Man, ancient Native American, this is a facial reconstruction from the skeleton done by the Smithsonian, has sort of a Caucasian type look to him, which surprised people. The coloring is just a lack of coloring there. You can't tell the coloring from a skeleton, obviously, and you can't really determine the hair types or things like that. But from the skeleton shape, they say, okay, this looks like a Caucasoid type face, and they can determine a lot about it, like the eyes, nose shape, and the facial structure, and then in terms of the hair and coloring, that's just estimated and tossed on. But nevertheless, this is a reconstruction done by the Smithsonian for what Kennewick Man could have looked like based off of the facial construction. All right, and then the key argument on dating is that people say, well, when you look it up, if you look at it says that Kennewick Man lived 9,000 years ago, so about 7,000 BC. And so Kennewick Man tested his haplogroup X. So if Kennewick Man really lived 7,000 BC, that's long before the Book of Mormon. And so that's a key argument to try to get rid of the haplogroup X evidence for the Book of Mormon. And in my book, Face of a Nephite, my study shows that I do think he was a Nephite, and I think he fits the Book of Mormon time frame. And I think that when you look at the carbon dating and you adjust it, I think he actually fits around 250 BC, and I explain that in depth in the book. I'll show you a couple of slides here so you know my basic logic that I use in the book. The first being that when people say that he was 9,000 years ago, that's based on some of the carbon date testing. What they don't tell you is that there was additional carbon date testing, which throws that into confusion or into some doubt. In particular, there are 20 samples that were carbon date tested for Kennewick Man. Many of those did produce dates 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, but some of those dates were only 2,000 to 2,600 or so years ago. And what that means is that for the carbon date testing, while most showed an old date, there were some that showed instead a date more like 200 to 250 BC. And so the question really is which dates are correct. And for the mainstream science, the dates don't really matter that much to them. They just went with the main testing. Most of the dates came back with 8,000, 9,000 years ago, so they said 9,000 years ago. And they just kind of tossed out the newer dates, the dates that show 200, 250 BC as being, well, those just must be errors. Those are outliers. But what I did is I took a look at, well, you have a collection of these that are all showing 200 to 250 BC. You have this other collection showing 8 to 9,000 years ago. One of the two is correct. One of the two is definitely wrong. One of the two is likely correct. Which is more likely correct? And what I found is that where Kennewick Man was buried, they had also done carbon dating of the sediments in the location where he was buried. And what it turned out was that the majority of the dates they obtained for those sediments where he was buried produced artificially aged and possibly old dates. which mean that he was likely in a context that was causing corruption of the carbon dating to make him look a lot older than he actually was. And so I determined that he is likely artificially aged. The more recent, the 200 BC to 400 BC dates were more likely correct. And then a second argument was that where he had been buried was in along a river bank or that eventually got washed out. That river bank has a volcanic ash layer. So there's a layer of a volcanic ash from a volcanic eruption, and it has this layer. Now he had been buried where he was washed out was just below a volcanic ash layer. So the question is was he there and the volcanic event happened later, or was he buried down through the volcanic ash? And there's a way that you can determine that. So what happened was that in looking at the skeleton was well preserved. There was no scavenging. The hands had been placed palms down. You could tell that by how the soil was connected to it. So it was clearly a protective burial. To maintain the kind of a protective burial where there's no scavenging and that kind of thing would have been to put him down a couple of feet at least into the ground. Now, he was less than just a matter of inches, less than a foot below the volcanic ash layer that was above him. The volcanic ash event, scientists generally date to 4,700 BC. What's interesting is that some of the volcanic ash from that layer was found attached to Kennewick Man's skeleton. What that means is that he couldn't have died 9,000 years ago, because if he had died 9,000 years ago, he had been buried, and then it was the volcanic ash event wasn't until a couple of thousand years after that. The volcanic ash would never have gotten attached to a skeleton. The only way that volcanic ash could be attached to a skeleton was if he was more recent than the volcanic event and was buried down through. So when they buried him, they buried down through the volcanic ash layer. So that's how the volcanic ash got attached to his skeleton. So what this means is that the dates that are given out there for Kennewick Man are incorrect. He can't be 9,000 years old because then he wouldn't have had the volcanic ash attached to him from this event that happened a couple thousand years after they're saying he died. He had to have been more recent, and he had to then it was buried through that volcanic ash layer, which is how he got the volcanic ash connected to him. So that's the response there on the dating. And so, as I've said to others, the Haplogroup X DNA evidence is fantastic because it's not just consistent with the Book of Mormon, but it's actually a DNA type which clearly came from the Middle East in ancient Native Americans, anciently from the Middle East as the location of origin. It's not found on the mainstream assumed, like a Bering Strait migration route. So likely came from boat from the Middle East to the ancient Native Americans. It's really good evidence for the Book of Mormon. And in terms of the dating, up until now, the only date which had shown, which said dates prior to the Book of Mormon was Kennewick Man. Kennewick Man was the only one where they could say, hey, it was before the Book of Mormon. But then the Kennewick Man, when you look at the actual dating, he fits the Book of Mormon, 200, 250 BC instead, something like that. Well, just recently there was a tweet by a man and he said that he was talking about a Native American burial in Newfoundland that's Haplogroup X, and he says that it's dated to 7,000 years ago. This is a tweet from just a few days ago on December 11th. So that got my curiosity, and I went ahead and I took a look to see, is this true? Because that would be significant if you had another carbon date test, not just that one Kennewick Man, which was clearly wrong. But if you had another carbon date test that showed Haplogroup X 2A in the Americas 7,000 years ago, that would be significant. So I went in and to take a look at and what I found is that what he said is incorrect. So this is the study that he had referred to as a 2017 study in the Current Biology journal. They studied the what they call the maritime archaic population that's in Newfoundland, Canada. And when I found the one that was dated to 7,000 years ago, it's not haplogroup X. Unfortunately, to get to it, it's not described in the journal. It's only in the supplementary information that you can link to. And so when you link to it, it pulls it up in an Excel chart. So what I have is this is the Excel chart of the data from that journal. And when you look at the supplementary data for that journal, and you look down to the one that they're talking about, which was this Lon Samor burial in Newfoundland. It's an adolescent. And the carbon date testing, as they say, 7,000 years ago. When you look to the mitochondrial, let me pull my picture over. When you look to the mitochondrial DNA haplogroup type, it's not X2A, it's C. It's C1C. So that tweet was incorrect. There has not been a finding of haplogroup X2A 7,000 years ago. But interestingly, what is found in this journal article is some more finding of haplogroup X2A DNA types among this maritime archaic culture, and there are some of these that show up to what they consider 4,000 years ago, so about 2000 BC. This would put them in the Jaredite time frame, so it's not too old to be consistent with the Book of Mormon. But it does raise complications because the haplogroup X, as I've looked at it, as others have looked at it, it would be considered to have been a Lehi, Lehi's group bringing it over, or maybe the Mulekites bringing it over, not the Jaredites. Now, the Jaredites did come from the Near East as well, so haplogroup X is a plausible Jaredite DNA type too. I've actually had some people say, well, maybe Kennewick Man was Jaredite. I said, I don't think so. I think he fits the Nephite Mulekite group, and part of the reason I think that is just the locations and also the DNA continuity. So when I say DNA continuity, what I mean is that this haplogroup X2A didn't just disappear or almost disappear. Instead, has stayed continuous in the Americas to present. And that works for the Lamanites, the Nephites, Lamanites, Mulekites, because they combined and did survive. It doesn't work for the Jaredites, at least with what the Book of Mormon says is true about the Jaredites dying out. So it just doesn't work. For a haplogroup X to work as a Jaredite DNA type, then you would have to assume that the Book of Mormon's incorrect about the Jaredites dying out, and instead assume that they intermingled and population survived. And I know some people do believe that, so that is a possibility. But for me, I think that it's more likely that the dating is wrong and that it fits the Nephite, Mulekite populations. But let me show you why. Okay, so this is the new DNA evidence I was talking about. There's nothing showing haplogroup X2A before the Book of Mormon timeframes, but there is some carbon dating suggesting it before Lehi's time frame, back to the Jaredites. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the video is just talk about that, and talk about why I think that the dating here is wrong as well. Okay, so let me move that out. Okay, so what was found in this study of these Native American populations in Newfoundland is that there is some connection in the populations that existed there, and I'll go ahead and talk about that in a little bit. But first, let me show you the location that they're looking at. This is the location where they said that this 7,000-year-old skeleton potentially existed. It's in L'Anse-Amour, Newfoundland. There's a burial mound that was there. And the first hint that something's wrong with the dating for this 7,000-year-old skeleton, this is the 7,000-year-old skeleton, not the 4,000-year-old ones. The first indication of something being wrong there is that when they talk about the skeleton, even though the carbon dating says 7,700 years ago, they say the body was covered with red ochre, and that along with it was a toggling harpoon, the earliest known toggling harpoon in the world. These are both red flags for an archaeologist that should have told them your dating is probably wrong. Why? Well, let's talk about it. What I'll show you is that this red ochre, covering a body with red ochre, is something that culture-wise was not done until the first millennium BC, 6,000 years after this. And then in terms of the toggling harpoon, what I'll show you is that to have this found in Newfoundland thousands of years before it was found anywhere else is a red flag. So you have two red flags here that the date is completely wrong. The covering of the body with this red ochre substance and the existence of a toggling harpoon, which would have been the earliest known existence for a toggling harpoon. Okay, so the Lansamore site is up here. This is you have the U.S., St. Lawrence Seaway going out, and then way up here on the coast here is the Lansamore site. Now, this maritime archaic population that they're looking at was on both coasts. So here, and then also on the other side here, and there's a site called Port au Choix, which are a number of other burials, and I'll show you that. These, so as indicated, the X2A, that one guy, that one tweet from one guy said, hey, this skeleton 7,000 years ago had X2A. That was incorrect. But in that same study, it showed from there some burials across the waterway over here, Port au Choix, that does have some X2A DNA types, and those they date to 4,000 years ago, or about 2000 BC, which would be Jaredite timeframes. And let me show you that location. Okay, yeah, here's the Port au Choix. Okay, so Port au Choix, as it says, where I just showed you where it was. And then it says that it had these maritime archaic Native Americans. They had cemeteries. It had dates as far back as 4,400 BC. These are the ones that were DNA tested in that study. And but what's interesting is that these sites also had the red ochre put on them. So this is another indication that even these dates are also incorrect. Looking at the maritime archaic people and who they were, it's basically a Native American group. They were on the coast. Up there, the water was believed to have been warmer in times past, and so some of those coastal areas, even though it's a lot of ice inland, the coastal areas were nice. It was a warmer water at the time, and then they knew how to boat. They would hunt, including whales. So, like I said, in some of these maritime archaic burials, it includes a toggling harpoon, which would have been used for whaling or seals or other things like that. And now as it says here, one thing that's unusual about it, though, is that some of the cultural aspects, including this use of white chert, and then in particular the red ochre, is that some of these maritime archaic finds have this use of red ochre on the burials. So red ochre is it's a mineral. It's got iron in it, and so it has this reddish color. And there was a phase of Native Americans where they would bury the bodies with this coloring. So it'd paint the body red, color the body red. and they call this the red ochre culture. And so some of these maritime archaic finds have this red ochre use. And so as it says here, there's dispute here and it's not generally accepted. And so they say, hey, carbon dating, we think this is 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years BC, but it's using red ochre on the burials, which wasn't done commonly until a couple of thousand years after that. And so there's a debate as to whether, okay, do you have two different cultures using red ochre, or is it just in that some were using it and then it bled into the other type of people? All right. So, and then it's this debate about the use of red ochre and whether was this really used in the maritime archaic people. What I'll show you is that I think that the dating is wrong and that the maritime archaic people, that what they're calling as 2000 BC were actually the red ochre people and were more recent. So let's show you the red ochre people. Okay. So again, the red ochre, this use of red ochre was something that was done throughout the Great Lakes. So this would fit with the Book of Mormon type populations and the Heartland theory. So throughout the Great Lakes, Illinois, Ohio River Valley, could go back as far as 1000 BC to 400 BC or so. But they would use this red ochre material and use it for the burials. As it says here, this culture used powdered red ochre in their burials. And so that gave rise to this red ochre population theory for this culture that was identified, and it was throughout this Great Lakes. Okay. So the use of this red ochre on those burials in Newfoundland means that you've got a conflict. You've got a cultural indicator, the use of red ochre, which would put it in the early BCs, the whatever 500 BC, 400 BC, 600 BC, somewhere in that time frame. And then you have a carbon dating which says 2000 BC. You have a conflict between your dating and your cultural signal, and you have to determine which is correct. And the mainstream archaeology, they've chosen to go with the carbon dating on this instead of the cultural symbol. But it's not just the red ochre, it's also that toggling harpoon, which was another sign that that really old date is incorrect. Because when you look at this, if you go and you look at information about the toggling harpoons, so what is a toggling harpoon? A toggling harpoon is when you're hunting like a whale or animal, and you get that harpoon in, you don't want it to just come back out because these are really big, heavy, strong animals. So you want it to go in and then open so that you can't pull it out very easily, and you could then have a better pull on the animal to help catch it. And then there was, with advancements with a rope to then make it so you could then pull it out more easily and so forth. But so this was a toggling harpoon, which is a big technological ancient breakthrough for hunting whales and that kind of thing. It says, so when you look at where did this technology come from, and what you'll find is that it came from the Inuits. And so this finding of it in Newfoundland is totally out of time frame and location for where this technology was known to have existed and come from. So as it says here, so the earliest unequivocal evidence of toggling harpoons is connected to the Paleo-Inuit migrations. And so the assumption had been that it was the Inuits who then, when they came to America, they spread this technology to the east. But the only conflicting point being this Newfoundland find says, well, but then there's this other piece of evidence with this carbon dating that harpoons in 1 to 2000 BC in Newfoundland. And then it's resulted in debates about this. And so what it's saying is that you've got this second point where logically when you have this technological advancement, it would have stayed and spread. And it's more likely that you have it in one location, it stays and spread. They have the archaeological evidence of the Inuits discovering this and that technology traveling from the east, Siberia, the polar across to the east. You do have evidence of the Inuits in Newfoundland around um, somewhere around 50 BC to up to about 1000 AD. So what happened was is you had this maritime archaic people that lived there, and then they sort of disappeared, and then you have the Inuit people live there, and then they sort of left, and then you have some Lamanite, they're called the Beothuk tribe, which has since gone extinct, which then lived there starting around 1200 AD. Looking at the culture, since this is an Inuit technology spread by the Inuits, you would say that, okay, this dating must have been wrong then, because it's a complete outlier showing a technology popping up over here in this part of the world, which has no relation to the Inuits on that part of the world, and you're putting it in a time frame which is, over 1,000 years before it's used by the Inuits elsewhere. Instead, the likelihood is that the carbon dating in Newfoundland is wrong. And what you instead have is the harpoon coming over with contact with from the Inuits and the red ochre culture being what is there with that maritime archaic people. And that would put them in that Book of Mormon time frame for Nephites, Mulekites. I know it's a little complicated. Hopefully you understand that, though. Here's what the population that ended up living there, as I mentioned, the Beothuk's. It's a tribe that went extinct. They're connected to the Algonquin tribes. There's been DNA testing for them. This is the Lamanite people post-Christ, basically. The haplogroup testing for them is what is similar to throughout the other Algonquin tribes. There's a high percentage of haplogroup X in them, but the other DNA types as well. This is a couple of the last Beothuks that existed. This is a Beothuk woman from 1819. And then as I said, they went extinct. The very last one was this individual. And interesting enough, he died, the very last one of their tribe died in June of 1829, which is when the Book of Mormon was finished being translated, June of 1829. And then there's no Beothuk since then. Okay. Now, this isn't the only, those who followed my other material, this isn't the only time I've said where I think that the carbon dating is wrong on a couple of points. I'll just note, I do think carbon dating is a good technology, and I think it's generally reliable. But what I have found through all of my studies as I go on is that I think it's unreliable starting around when you start to get the dates around 1000 BC and older. You often get things that just don't make sense. And that's not just speaking from a young Earth creationist aspect, although that's important too. But it's not just my opinion, but what it does is you start to get weird dates that completely mess up and confuse the archaeology. And sometimes the scientists will recognize that and fix it, but other times they'll stick with a date and just ignore that it doesn't make sense. The date doesn't, it makes it so that the archaeology doesn't match. The cultures don't match. The other things don't match. And so I did one on Poverty Point, which is a site in Louisiana. And when I did a video on the Poverty Point site in Louisiana, I noted that the carbon date testing for it showed 1700 to 1100 BC time frame. So I said, well, that could be Jaredite. That would fit in a Jaredite time frame for the Book of Mormon. But as I studied the site, I said, I think that carbon dating is wrong. And I did a presentation explaining why I think that carbon dating is wrong. And I'll show you that. And it's a very similar problem to what we have with this Newfoundland site. So this is the Poverty Point site, what it looks like. Did some slides on it, and again, the mounds that were built had a central 70-foot tall mound and a complex. I thought this was a Lamanite site. Here's some of the artifacts that are there. It looks like almost like dice and cooking balls and spears and all kinds of um, ornaments, pottery, statues, use of copper, all kinds of stuff. And then I have this slide here, and it was on, is the age for Poverty Point correct? And what I noted was that, okay, so the carbon dating says 1700 BC to 1100 BC. That would line them up with the Jaredites for the Book of Mormon. But there are a few things that just don't make sense. And one is that Poverty Point is very much like other sites, large sites in North America that instead date to the Lamanite, Nephite, Mulekite timeframe, 200 BC to 400 AD, based on separate carbon dating. And some of the example sites are like the Pinson Mounds and Fort Ancient, Chillicothe areas, the Marksville, Louisiana site. And they all date, their carbon dating was all fitting in the 200 BC to 400 AD timeframe. And then you have this Poverty Point site, which is a lot like those, that they has this older date. And in addition, there are some features that show a central common planning. For example, several of these sites, like the Pinson Mound site, they have the exact same overall acreage. They were both 400-acre sites. They both had a central mound that was 70 feet tall, approximately 70 feet tall. Both sites had a rectangular platform mound. So what this does is it shows a common culture, a common time frame where you're planning out these sites. It's like 400-acre site, 70-foot mound, rectangular platform. It's clearly designed by the same culture. And in addition, when you look at the artifacts from the site, it showed the existence of artifacts going back and forth between the two sites. So, for example, in the Pinson Mound site, they saw Poverty Point clay cooking balls and other objects from Poverty Point. And Poverty Point, they see stuff from the Pinson Mounds location and some of the Hopewell sites in Georgia and up to the copper from the Upper Peninsula and all that kind of stuff. So it shows that those sites were operated simultaneously. They overlap in terms of time frame. But then the carbon dating said 1700 BC to 1100 BC, whereas the other ones were 200 BC to 400 AD. It doesn't make any sense. So what I'm saying is the carbon dating was clearly wrong. It's an outlier because you can tell by the common planning, the common culture, and the ongoing trading of artifacts between the sites that they have to be coexisting time frames. It can't be 1700 BC to 1100 BC. It has to be overlapping time frame with those other sites. And so you've got an outlier here and you need to fix it. So I viewed the Poverty Point site as a Lamanite site with the carbon dating wrong. And the carbon dating being wrong isn't that much of a surprise because it's actually fairly common for carbon dating to get contamination. And you can get older dates, especially if you're dealing in a setting where there's a lot of low carbon water in the vicinity, which is what you would have had at Poverty Point, and it's also what you would have had in these Newfoundland locations with glacial meltwater right on the ocean, with those low carbon sources that could very conceivably result in artificially aged older dates. Okay, so what this shows you is just like with that Poverty Point site. I think that the Newfoundland sites where they're saying this Haplogroup X has been found in some skeletons and they carbon date to 2000 BC. What I'm telling you is that, okay, if the carbon dating were right, that would fit the Jaredites. That's okay. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, though, for the Book of Mormon because you have the later, you can also test the DNA for those populations, and it fits the DNA that you get later. So that would mean that the Book of Mormon's incorrect about the Jaredites dying out. I think realistically, the more logical answer is that the dating's wrong. And just like they got the Poverty Point dating wrong, they're getting the Newfoundland dating wrong, relying on the carbon dates and ignoring the fact that the cultural things of what they're seeing there with the use of the red ochre, that's something that was done thousands of years later. And the toggle harpoon, that's something that wasn't invented and used until thousands of years later. Those are big red flags that the dating is wrong on those sites, and it's actually more likely a Nephite, Lamanite type site that was up there in Newfoundland at the time frame. So summing up, for this Native American group in Newfoundland that has this haplogroup X DNA, I have a proposed new timeline for it. And my proposed timeline is that the 5000 BC to 1000 BC dates for what they call the maritime archaic culture is wrong. Instead, the red ochre style burials connect them with the red ochre people that were in the Great Lakes area 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. The DNA also matches between the two groups, very similar with high X2A concentration, and that supports that conclusion. So that would indicate that the carbon dates are outliers and likely wrong. Now, connecting to the Book of Mormon, the haplogroup X2A DNA that's found in Newfoundland more likely fits a Nephite-Mulekite population rather than a Jaredite population, and this is because of the strong, close DNA relationship to the later Lamanite tribes that lived there, the Beothukes, up until the 1800s. Like I said, it could be the Jaredites, but Book of Mormon indicates the Jaredites died out, so you wouldn't think you would have the same similar DNA findings between the two. Instead, you have similar DNA findings, so more likely the result is that you had a population that went up there, settled it, left, and then you have the later tribe that goes up there around 1200 AD, the Beothukes, who then lived there. So you have two tribes that went up there separately from the same source, rather than being something like the Jaredites that died out and then replaced by a different population. There's a plausible connection to Haygoth or other groups that migrated north in the first century BC. You know, they describe as taking boats and going up north. That would make sense, going up the St. Lawrence way north. That population clearly was good with boats, and they did whaling and other stuff with their harpoons. So that is a possibility. In the Book of Mormon, I think when you have Haygoth and all these groups migrating north, to me it indicated a change or improvement in the climate to the north to make it more habitable, and maybe that fits there. Okay, and so the Newfoundland sites, like I said, ended up being abandoned by that first population called the Maritime Archaic, probably Nephite Mulekites. They were then occupied by Paleo Inuits for several hundred years, and then the Beothuk people, which is Lamanite descendants, then occupied the site from 1200 AD to the last one passed away in 1829 AD. So that's what I think the time frame comes to. So that's the information related to this updated Haplogroup X DNA information. Hopefully it wasn't too complicated. I look forward to your thoughts and comments. If you have any questions as well, put them down below, and I'm happy to respond to them. Thanks.